Can you give our viewers an update on where your government's move to close the borders is at? When does it come into force and how are you going to police that?
Sure, it comes into force midnight tonight, and our State Disaster Coordinator is working very closely with the agencies along the border. And of course, this is not about prohibiting people from Tweed that have a close relationship to Queensland. This is about saying to people who are living in New South Wales and Victoria, if you are thinking about coming up to Queensland now is not the time. The border is closed to you. Of course, our freight will be going to and fro, and there's no changes there. But I make no apologies to protecting the health of Queenslanders in this state. It is not uncommon. It was done 100 years ago during the Spanish flu pandemic. And as we know, South Australia, Western Australia and Northern Territory are also closing its borders as well. Everyone should be staying safe. They should be staying in their state, and they should be staying as much as possible in their suburb. Of course, people have to go to work. We have essential work that needs to happen across our country to keep the supply chains going, to make sure that the food is coming into our supermarkets. But now is not the time to think about a holiday. As I said to Queensland viewers earlier today, school holidays is cancelled. There will be a school break, but the holiday season as we know it is not happening at this time of the pandemic.
And for those people who do commute from the Tweed to Queensland and in those border communities, will they have permits to be able to do that? How's that going to work?
Yes. The police are working on permits at the moment. We want free movement of the people who have permits and also the trucks to come across the border. This is about saying to people who are living in Sydney or living in Melbourne who thought, hey, it might be a nice idea to go to the Gold Coast for the next couple of months, I'm sorry, the borders are shut to you.
What about the schools? What's your view on that? We've heard different views from the medical experts. The Prime Minister's adamant that he wants to keep the schools open as long as possible to ensure that kids do get their education, don't lose an entire year. Where do you stand on it?
Well, I think this is a really interesting discussion because, first and foremost, we are listening to the health advice, and the health advice is that it is safe to send your children to school. Having said that, I understand that there is concern out there from parents, there is concern out there from teachers, and I think that you will see that the Prime Minister and the Premiers are all listening to those concerns, and we will see some changes come into place from next week. I think it's very important that our essential workers have somewhere to send their students to school. It is absolutely crucial during this time. Our healthcare workers, the people who are working on supply chains, the people who are working in construction, there's a whole range of essential workers that will need their students to continue in school until the end of term. So I think you will see some changes. You'll see the Prime Minister listening to the community, listening to Australians, and of course we're listening here in Queensland to our teachers and our frontline personnel. But let me say this as well. It is absolutely imperative, and my Minister for Education gave this direction earlier this week, that if you're over 60 and you have one of those underlying health conditions, you should not be having contact with others in that classroom or that school setting. We need to protect the most vulnerable during this time. It is absolutely crucial.
But you're saying changes likely next week. Are you suggesting, it seems to me that you're suggesting that basically schools will remain open with the skeleton staff to ensure that essential workers, those in the, whether they're medical workers, police, the military, that they will have somewhere for their kids to go.
Yeah, but also too, let's not forget, there's a lot of people in my electorate that work in supermarkets and work in big warehouses that have to get the supply chains as well. They need somewhere to send their students. They should be going to school as well. So I'm not just talking about our emergency services. It's the workers in the workforce. So look, I think you'll see that everybody is listening here, and we want to get through this as smoothly as possible.
The Victorian Premier seems to indicate that they're willing to go to stage 3 shutdown sooner. They're in a more difficult position than other states. Queensland, though, up 46 overnight to 443. The number is not that far behind. Would you also, like Daniel Andrews, be willing to go to that next stage of shutdown ahead of other states and territories?
Now, that's a really good question, and I think the Prime Minister touched on this, and I'll back in what the Prime Minister said. He said that different states will do different measures at different times. We want to have national consistency as much as possible, and the National Cabinet is working extremely well, and the Prime Minister is showing great leadership in the way he chairs those meetings and reports to the Australian public. But in relation to those different stages, New South Wales and Victoria are at a different stage to Queensland. So I think you will see that there is perhaps more community-to-community transmission happening in New South Wales and Victoria, and they might make further measures ahead of Queensland, where large numbers of ours are from overseas, but also they have been close contacts with people who have returned from overseas. We are going to continue to see increases in numbers because there was still a large number of people who returned to Australia from overseas, from those high-risk countries. So that is not going to be unusual. Also, our social distancing and all the measures we're putting in place as a National Cabinet announced by the Prime Minister, we're probably not going to see the full impact of that until the next week to fortnight. So we need to practice that social distancing, and as much as possible we need to stay close to our suburb. What I say in Queensland is stay in your state, stay in your suburb as much as possible.
And on that front, do you look at your numbers and think, is the medical advice to you a cause for some optimism now that you, through these measures, are looking not just Queensland but the rest of the country like we might be close to seeing that the flattening of the curve, as they say?
Well, I think everyone wants to see the flattening of the curve, and we know that our hospitals are going to see demands like they have never seen before, and they will not be able to cope Australia-wide unless we flatten that curve. So everyone has a responsibility. Every single one of us has a social responsibility to our family, to our friends, to our neighbours, to people living in our community, especially those most vulnerable, to actually do the right thing during this time.
And just finally, you mentioned the National Cabinet. It's working well in your view. Bit of a hiccup at the weekend with the New South Wales and Victoria getting ahead of the federal government and the National Cabinet with some of their statements. Has that been smoothed out now? Are things back on a more unified position? Because it is a very worthwhile platform with which to see leadership at this time.
It is. In fact, I want to commend the Prime Minister for establishing the National Cabinet. I've never seen such cooperation. I've often said that we all work best when we work together, but it is so encouraging to see all of the leaders come together with the best interests of their people at heart. And we know that everyone's going through awful times. I mean, there's no way to describe it. People are losing their jobs left, right and centre. Families are being completely turned on their heads. It is a social upheaval, the likes of which we've never seen in our lifetime. But if we all work together and we get through this, I honestly believe that there will be light at the end of the tunnel. We go through a lot in our state, and I know we go through a lot in our nation. We've had the bushfires, we've had floods up here, we've had cyclones. But we work best when we work together, and we will get through it. And let's get Queensland and Australia back to the way it was. And we can do that if now we put in these tough measures and we all abide by them. And, you know, it's not easy for a lot of people. There's going to be a lot of people feeling isolated. So, yes, everyone's working in the best interest of their state and working together. Yeah, absolutely. I can 100% say that.
And on the state election, we're almost out of time, and you've got a busy afternoon ahead of you, but the state election, 31st of October, is that locked in? I know you have set that date, it's fixed dates, terms I believe in Queensland, but is there any flexibility in that to push it back if need be?
Well, that's the intention. It's locked in. There's no intention to change it at this stage.
Premier, I appreciate your time. Thanks.
Anytime. Thank you.